Well, welcome, everyone. Uh, I am Daniel Schrader, the director of the Center for Jewish Studies and professor of history at the University of Minnesota. It's my great privilege to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture by Tony Michels on communism, Zionism, and American Jewish politics during the 1940s. Professor Michels' talk today is part of the Center for Jewish Studies 2021-22 lecture series. We're grateful for the generous gift, memory of Julia Kay and Harold Segal, in support of the series that has really allowed us to bring renowned scholars on a wide array of subjects, both to the campus community and the wider public. So welcome, everyone. Many thanks to our co-sponsors at the University of Minnesota for this afternoon's lecture, the Departments of American Studies, History, and Political Science. And I'm particularly grateful to Natan Paradise, the Associate Director of the Center for Jewish Studies, for all his work in organizing the lecture series, and to Mario Coulter, the Center's Outreach Program Coordinator, for helping to make our programs happen. So it's now my great honor to introduce Professor Tony Michels. In fact, this is the second time that I am introducing him this week. We had the great pleasure of having him and hearing him virtually on Monday in a roundtable for our symposium presented by the Center for Jewish Studies and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies on anti-Semitism and racism in a moment of reckoning. So if you missed hearing Professor Michels and this truly insightful and pertinent symposium, a recording will soon be available on the Center for Jewish Studies. And now to introduce Tony Michels, who is the George L. Mosse Professor of American Jewish History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is the author of a number of books and many publications. His books include A Fire in Their Hearts, Yiddish Socialists in New York. He's the editor of the book, Jewish Radicals, A Documentary History, and co-editor of the Cambridge History of Judaism, and the 8th volume of this major scholarly production on the modern world, 1815 to 2000. And he's the author of many other fascinating and important articles and reviews on his areas of expertise, which he is truly one of the leaders in these areas on American Jewish history and politics, Russian Jewish history, Yiddish culture and socialism, and working class history of American Jews, to name some of the major areas of his research. He is currently completing a book on the relationship of American Jews and the Soviet Union. We will leave some time for discussion at the end of the lecture, so please submit your questions and comments to Q&A found at the bottom of your screen. So it's now my pleasure to turn this over to Professor Michels. Tony, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Schrader, for that really truly generous introduction. It's an honor to be here virtually with you twice in the same week. I'm grateful for the invitation, and as I say, I'm honored. I'm going to speak today on an episode, what I think is an important episode in the history of Jewish politics and the politics of the American left more broadly. And that is the movement for what was called, at least called by communists, Jewish people's unity during World War II, specifically from 1941 to 45. It's part of a larger story of Jews and their very complicated relationship to the Soviet Union, and before that, the Russian Revolutionary Movement. It's particularly complicated. Well, it's complicated because the revolution and what came out of it was complicated for a host of reasons that were felt across the world. But there was a particular Jewish dimension to it that today's topic fits into. And that is this, that the Jewish community in the United States and elsewhere had a great stake in the revolution for the most existential of reasons. And that is that at certain points, starting with the October Revolution itself, and then at certain points in history beyond that, the very existence of the Jewish people depended on the outcome of the revolution. Between 1918 and 1921, the civil war in Russia resulted in mass killings of Jews. Perhaps as many as 200,000 Jews were slaughtered during the Civil War, mostly at the hands of monarchists, Ukrainian nationalists, and others who were anti-Bolshevik. A huge number of Jews were displaced, killed, maimed, raped. It was truly an awful experience that shook the Jewish world at that time between 1918 and 1921. And what American Jews understood, whether they were communists or not, whatever their political perspective, they knew that the existence of Jews in Russia depended on the Red Army's success in defeating counter-revolutionary forces and therefore saving Jewish lives. This cycle, a certain pattern arose. The second time this happened was during World War II, when again the Soviet Union, the victory of the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany was the matter of life or death for Eastern European Jews. That needs no elaboration, I think. And then again, 3 years after the defeat of the Axis powers, Israel's war for independence also was a matter in which the survival of a large Jewish community was at stake. And once again, it was the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe, allied countries in Eastern Europe, that provided in this case, the diplomatic support and military support that was crucial for Israel's survival. So at least those three episodes, 1918 to 1921, World War II, Israel's struggle for independence, the existence of large Jewish communities depended on the support, backing, and defense of the Soviet Union. I know this may sound strange, especially from a 21st century view, when the Soviet Union came to act in different ways towards Jews. And that also plays into the fraught relationship between Jews and the Soviet Union. There were other periods of time when the Soviet Union, especially starting in the late Stalin period, enacted various anti-Semitic policies that would make the Soviet Union appear as not the defender of the Jewish people, but its enemies. So we're talking about an ambiguous relationship between Jews and the Soviet Union. Let me just say something on top of it to heighten the complexity of how Jews understood the Soviet Union. And that is that from the perspective of a good many Jews, the domestic policies of the Soviet Union, particularly the nationalities policies of the Soviet government in building up, for instance, Yiddish culture and establishing Jewish colonies in various parts of the Soviet Union, perhaps most famously and least successfully in Azerbaijan, the idea that there is a Jewish homeland in the Soviet Union, proved to be inspiring for large numbers of Jews in the United States. And then again, there are other times in which Soviet policies seem to show just the opposite, that the Soviet Union was an enemy of Jewish culture, an enemy of the Jewish religion, and actively working to force Jews into assimilation. So for these reasons, these very contradictory realities and reactions to the Soviet Union over a period of time made for a very, very fraught relationship between Jews and the Soviet Union. So today I'm going to discuss one very important episode of this overall relationship. And that is what communists called, American communists called, the movement for Jewish people's unity during World War II. It was basically this. The idea was that to defeat Nazi Germany, Jews of all social classes, religious persuasions, and political orientations should join together in a common anti-Nazi struggle. That was the basic view behind it. And it was never totally successful, as we're going to see, but it was a remarkable story because of the extent of this movement to support the Soviet government in the struggle against Nazi Germany brought a high level of cooperation across the Jewish community. It was very rare at the time as since. So I want to turn to that now. And the story really starts in the August 24th, 1941. We can pinpoint the date because it was on that date when a rally took place in Moscow, organized by some of the leading Jewish intellectuals, writers, actors, and others, organized, of course, with the approval of the Soviet government at the highest level, to organize this rally. And the purpose of the rally was to speak to Jews in the West, especially in England, in the United States, and to call on them to support Soviet Jewry in this moment, this decisive moment, this very, very dangerous moment, perilous moment. This is just 2 months after Nazi Germany had invaded the Soviet Union. And I'm going to read you portions of the speeches that were delivered in Yiddish to give you a feel of this event and the effect it had on American Jews. So for instance, the Yiddish novelist David Bergelson warned of the annihilation of the Jewish people. And his colleague Peretz Markish said that entire Jewish communities were being turned into, quote, mountains of corpse and ashes. The actor Shloime Michels decried, quote, the torture and violence against our mothers, sisters, and little children. And at the end of this rally, a joint statement was read to Jews in the West, and it said, quote, we hasten our appeal to you together with the voices of millions of Jews whose blood has been spilled. Our words rush forth to you as a signal, calling for resistance and revenge. Let every passing day bring you closer to the hour of reckoning with the enemy. Let the sacred flame of vengeance burn brighter in your heart with every passing hour. Let your every minute be ready for action. I should also say this was meant for Soviet Jews as well as Jews in the West. I may have forgotten to mention that. So, all right, this was an incredible statement. The statement was broadcast over radio. It was reprinted. The speeches were reprinted in English and in Yiddish. And it proved to be a decisive moment. The leading figures of Russian Jewry were crying out to Jews in the West, in the United States especially, to come to the aid of Soviet Jews, the Soviet government, and the Red Army. And this was a first, I should say. There had never been, since 1917, an effort by the Soviet government to actively mobilize American Jews on behalf of the Soviet government, certainly not on this scale. The results were the results were noticeable almost immediately. The first result, the first effect, was that American communists declared their willingness to join with all elements in the American Jewish community for a common cause. This meant businessmen and workers, rabbis and secularists, liberals and communists, Zionists and anti-Zionists. Everybody now was summoned to come together in the name of what communists called Jewish people's unity. To just underscore how dramatic this departure was, there was first of all, there was great division in the Jewish community. More specifically, communists in this country had always rejected the idea of a unified Jewish community. From the very outset of the communist movement in 1919, the whole notion of Jewish people's unity or Jewish unity, or to use the Hebrew term, Klal Yisrael, this was ridiculed, rejected by communists. So this was a complete reversal from communist policies going back to 1919 when the party was founded. I should state here as an aside that the Communist Party during the war was a popular movement, had at least 80,000 members, quite possibly higher, and it had wide influence through an array of non-communist organizations, artistic, cultural organizations, social organizations of various kinds, philanthropic. It was a wide, broadly based movement. On top of that, it had grown to an important force in the Jewish community. They were a minority in the Jewish community, but the majority of communists, certainly in the strongholds of New York City and some other cities, the majority of the communist movement was Jewish. There's a high degree of overlap between American communism in the 40s and the Jewish community. So this was an important change when communists in the summer and fall of 1941 started issuing calls for Jewish unity across all lines. The second important and dramatic effect of the Moscow rally was the fact that so many Jews across all the divisions that I just mentioned responded affirmatively. And as we're going to see, the collaboration between liberals, radicals, Reform, conservative, and Orthodox Jews, Zionists and non-Zionists, was really startling in comparison with the level of division that existed previously. There were two main organizations that I'm going to discuss now that anchored this Jewish people's movement. One was called the Committee of Jewish Writers, Jewish writers, artists, and scientists, usually just referred to as the Writers Committee. And I'll use that term just because it's more convenient than the whole term, which was quite long. Right. The idea behind this is this committee was to be a kind of mirror of what the Soviet Union created, which was something called the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. The Anti-Fascist Committee grew out of that Moscow rally in 1941 and consisted of some of the major Yiddish writers and cultural figures who spoke in August and who I quoted to you. And the whole purpose of that Anti-Fascist Committee, or one of the main purposes, I should say, not the only one of the main purposes was to rally Jews in the West on a permanent and active basis. The Writers Committee that I just referred to was supposed to be the mirror image of the Soviet Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. The chairman of it was a man named Chaim Zhitlovsky, a name that probably won't be familiar to anyone today, very few people. Zhitlovsky was not a communist, but an avowed fellow traveler, an admirer of the Soviet Union. He was known mostly as a writer, an intellectual, and the major theoretician of Yiddish culture in the United States, major proponent of it. His view of the Soviet Union was very interesting. As I say, he wasn't a communist, but his idea about the Soviet Union was basically this. The Soviet Union was the only country in the world to solve what was called the Jewish question in most of its dimensions. According to Zhitlovsky, the Soviet Union had given Jews full civil rights. They were emancipated, fully equal citizens. Number two, it had given Jews cultural rights, the right to maintain their own Yiddish language culture on the basis, on their legal definition as a Jewish nation, and Zhitlovsky approved of that. Finally, it had granted a territory to the Jews in the form of Birobidzhan in the Soviet Far East. And so Zhitlovsky wrote, quote, "Where else in the world are we recognized as a people with equal rights? Where else in the world does the government create for us all the most important possibilities for our own progressive Jewish national life? Where else are we conferred our own Jewish land?" End quote. So his view was that American Jews of whatever persuasion must support the USSR wholeheartedly and without conditions. To him, it was unthinkable to do otherwise. He became the figurehead of this Jewish Writers Committee. And somehow, and I'm really not clear how they were managed to do this, they were able to gain the signatures of 200 prominent intellectuals on a statement promising to, quote, "make the greatest sacrifices to help bring about the greatest possible cooperation and fraternity to bring the two great sections of our people, the Jews of the United States and the Jews of the Soviet Union, end quote. Now, I just want to draw your attention to something in that statement, which is interesting. The statement doesn't say all sections of the Jewish community in America should come together simply to defeat Nazis. They were going beyond that. They were gesturing to something else, that through the struggle to defeat the Nazis, there would be a unification, if you will, a reunification of Soviet Jewry, Russian Jewry, and American Jewry, the two largest Jewish communities in the world. And that this would bring about, it's suggested in this initial statement and would be elaborated further, a kind of Jewish national renaissance across the Atlantic. All right. So this was the statement of this Writers' Committee. The Writers' Committee was, with Zhidlovsky at the head, was formed by a very small group of Yiddish writers, mostly communists or fellow travelers. But the endorsements they garnered were remarkable. Signatories included Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein proved to be one of the most valuable spokesmen for the Writers' Committee. Ira Gershwin, the actor John Garfield, Franz Boas, the writer Waldo Frank, and M. Lincoln Schuster, the co-founder of Simon & Schuster, the publishing firm. Right? These were just some of the luminaries who had signed on to this statement calling for Jewish support for the Soviet Union. There was a successful rally in October of 1941 that filled up one of the larger halls in Manhattan. And that was followed with an even more impressive rally called a Unite for Victory rally in Madison Square Garden in December 17th. At this point, America had entered the war. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States was just a few weeks away from forming the Grand Alliance with Great Britain and the Soviet Union. So now the national and international context had changed in a way that was very favorable to the goals of the Communist Party in the United States. The United States was now involved in the war and in an alliance with the Soviet Union. I'll just describe for you this rally because it's really remarkable, the size of it and the kind of the visibility of it. There were about 20,000 people who showed up that night at Madison Square Garden. And these weren't just Jewish intellectuals. They included Senator Thomas of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Representative Saul Bloom from the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Czech Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk. The greetings were sent from the Soviet ambassador Maxim Litvinov. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt sent her greetings. New York Senator Robert Wagner, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, and others all sent their greetings. And of course, there were others who were there as spoken person. And to give you a flavor of the atmosphere, just to give you a sense of the atmosphere of that night, I'm going to quote from you a speech given by someone named Abraham Goldberg, who was a member of the World Zionist Organizing Committee. And he really captured the spirit of the evening in his tremendous praise for the Soviet Union. I'm going to read to you excerpts of the speech. Goldberg didn't just praise the Soviet Union for heroically fighting Nazi Germany. He depicted the Soviet Union as the greatest of friends to the Jews. He praised Ambassador Litvinov, who himself was of Jewish parentage, as an exemplary, quote, son of our people and an outstanding statesman. He said, with the Soviet Union would predict, quote, would create the kind of world that Jews have dreamed about through thousands of years, the kind of world Russia has dreamed about. He went on to say, that's end quote. He went on to say, Goldberg, that a victorious Soviet Union would help secure what he described as Jewish ideals of, quote, a decent humanity and the brotherhood of nations. And he concluded by saying, Goldberg concluded by saying to the audience, we Jews feel more secure that when we realize that the great Russian nation will be sitting at the peace table after the war. With her at the table, the Jews will not be wronged, end quote. So again, there's this incredible outpouring of respect and appreciation and praise for the Soviet Union that is now seen not only as an ally of convenience, but indeed one of the greatest defender of the Jewish people that was expected to continue after the war. All right. This speech sounded themes that were heard over and over again during the war. Again, Goldberg is not a communist. He was one of the most prominent Zionists in the United States. A liberal, political liberal, but not a communist. So that's one organization that came out of the Moscow rally of August 1941. the Writers' Committee, the Committee of Jewish Writers, Artists, and Intellectuals, this body of prominent individuals whose task it was to mobilize public opinion on behalf of Russia. The second organization I'll just mention, the other pillar of this Jewish unity movement, was the Jewish Council of Russian War Relief, which was founded actually by Abraham Goldberg, the man I just quoted. It was founded in 1942 and by Goldberg, and it was truly a mass organization. It was founded at a conference attended by more than 2,000 delegates, representing 763 organizations that had a total membership of almost 260,000. It was, in other words, a broad-based organization that encompassed hundreds of others under it, the purpose of which was to create what was called the Jewish Council of Russian War Relief. The whole purpose was to raise money for the Red Army and Soviet humanitarian aid. The founding report stated its rationale. Quote, "We feel that the Jewish Council for Russian War Relief has a particular responsibility toward the people of Soviet Russia because we are Jews. And as Jews, we know that the Soviet Union, during its 8 months of bitter and unremitting warfare against the Hitler armies, has taken this leadership in annihilating from the face of the earth the greatest enemy of Jewry in all of history." The popular novelist, end quote, the popular Yiddish novelist Sholem Asch proclaimed at this February conference establishing the Russian Council of Russian War Relief, quote, "It is important for the Russian people to know about this meeting. We want the Russians in every hamlet to know that wherever Jews meet, the Jewish heart beats in tune with the Russian heart," end quote. So again, the themes were of solidarity with the Soviet people, support for the Soviet state and the Red Army, and all framed in the language of Jewish national unity. I won't go into the workings of the Jewish Council of Russian War Relief, but just so you can have a picture of it, it was an umbrella organization with subcommittees at the national level, regional committees, local communities, and then committees with a more specialized purpose. So there was a women's division that was chaired by Judge Anna Cross, a judge in New York. She headed the women's committee. There was a Ukrainian committee for Jews who hailed from Ukraine and wished to give money to Jews and non-Jews displaced in Ukraine. Over the course of the 4 years, $10 million was raised in the Jewish community for the Jewish Council of Russian War Relief. That's the equivalent to $146 million today. It was really an impressive fundraising operation. So there was an organizational triad that I'm trying to describe: the Jewish Council of Russian War Relief, the Writers' Committee in the United States, and then in the Soviet Union, there was the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. The three organizations were in regular contact with each other, and they coordinated activities together. And often the American organizations took direction from the Soviet Anti-Fascist Committee. So for instance, to give you one example of what was really a dramatic event, in May 1942, there was a mass rally staged simultaneously in Moscow and New York, and I believe in Chicago as well. There was a simultaneous rally in which speakers in each city gave dramatic speeches and issued calls to action. All of this was, again, broadcast on radio. The speeches on the Soviet side urged American Jews not only to raise money, but also to join the army and fight, the American army, and fight. They spoke of atrocities. It was highly emotional. These are highly emotional speeches. And on the American side, there was this feeling that the Soviet Union had what was in the offing was not just an anti-fascist movement, that was important enough, but this new alliance between Jews across the Atlantic, two Jewish communities, the largest ones, as I've said, but that had been cut off from each other for years since the revolution. So this was seen as a breach of an unnatural rift, a healing rather, of an unnatural rift between the major Jewish communities of the world. I'm going to quote Goldberg again. This was his speech on this May event that brought the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee together by radio broadcast with its American counterparts. Goldberg said, "We see beautiful dreams before our eyes, and we are thankful to you, dear Jews, for extending your hands in friendship across the seas in calls for unification." And then he went on to quote Psalm 118. He stated in Hebrew, Zeh hayom nagila bo. This is the day in which we rejoice. He left out any reference to God because he was a secularist, but it still captures the sentiment. Let me give you several other quotes, because it's important to convey the emotion and the significance, the import in which American Jews attached to these newly established ties to Soviet Jews through the Anti-Fascist Committee. This is Nachum Goldman, who is chairman of the World Jewish Congress. He also expressed this hope for the unification of what he called world Jewry. He said the Soviet Union would play a vital part in the solving of the Jewish problem after the war. And he continued, quote, "As a Zionist, I believe in Soviet Russia's sympathy and understanding for the desire of the Jewish people to revive their homeland in Palestine, to safeguard the Jewish future by reestablishing its full national life in Palestine." So he's going beyond, again, the defeat of Germany as a goal. Goldman is looking after the war and seeing the Soviet Union as the great protector of Jewish national goals once Nazis were defeated. I'm going to give you another quote from the spring of 1942. This comes from Rabbi Joseph Lookstein, who was president of the Rabbinical Council of America, an Orthodox Association of Rabbis. This was at a banquet in honor of Albert Einstein, who was the honorary chairman of the Jewish Council for Russian War Relief, actually. So this is a separate event than the one I referred to with the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Lookstein delivered the following invocation, and it's a paragraph I want to read in full. Quote, "If freedom will triumph, if freedom will triumph, then Russia's will be the major share in that triumph. If human decency will survive, then Russia will be the major contributor. If the dignity of personality will prevail, then Russia's sacrifice will have made it possible. If the brotherhood of man will be translated from prophetic vision to living reality, then Russia will have been the principal benefactor. And this is to me the key line, and if the messianic dream of the kingdom of God on earth will become fact, then Russia will have hastened the steps of the Messiah." End quote. I don't think that is the reference to the Messiah. I don't believe that is simply rhetorical flourish. I think that was a genuinely felt emotion that I've seen. You can see in the speeches and the articles. There's a feeling that there is a messianic or quasi-messianic breakthrough about to happen, coming out of the catastrophe of World War II, made possible by the Soviet Union. Chaim Shidlovsky spoke in similar terms, that there is that with what was expected to be the Soviet victory, Jews would enter into a whole new era of their history, marked by global Jewish national unity, to use his words. All right, so I hope those passages give you some sense of, again, the emotions and the expectations that came out of the creation of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee in the early period of the war. I'm going to turn to you, I'm going to give you an example of the practical efforts that these different organizations pursued during the war. And the example I'm going to give to you is what was called the Tank Campaign. The Tank Campaign was a campaign to raise enough money to purchase 1,000 tanks and 500 airplanes, each of them to be named after a prominent Jew, what was described as a Jewish hero from the past. The idea is that American Jews would raise money, purchase these planes for the Red Army, or tanks for the Red Army, named after, quote, this is a quote from the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, "great fighters of the Jewish people and brilliant Jewish thinkers." And now, if I can do this properly, and there's absolutely no guarantee that I can, I'm going to try and show you 3 images. from what was called the tank campaign. Okay, I'm going to share screen and share. I have to speak to myself here because I'm so inept. Okay, all right, I'm going to show you 3 images that were circulating at the time. I love this one. This is a cartoon by the communist illustrator, William Gropper. And what you're looking at here, hopefully you can see my cursor. You're seeing the planes, these are the bombers in the back, rows and rows of tanks. And I'll read to you what they say in Yiddish. This tank is a Chaim Solomon tank in honor of American Jews. Chaim Solomon was a Jewish hero from the Revolutionary War. Here you see a Bar Kokhba tank. This is, of course, the great Jewish hero that fought the Romans. This is on behalf of Soviet Jews. You see here Judah Maccabee, who will soon be honoring with the Hanukkah holiday. We have Spinoza. This is a Spinoza tank. You have over here a Sholem Aleichem tank, named after the great Yiddish novelist, a Peretz tank, named after another great Yiddish writer. And it goes on like this. There's a whole list of names that the Soviet Union proposed for American Jews to raise money in their honor. So you have Hitler here, terrified that these Jewish tanks, named after Sholem Aleichem and Chaim Solomon, Bar Kokhba and Judah Maccabee, Yehuda Maccabee, and so forth, are coming after him. This is a flyer for a rally in Oakland, California. Tanks for the Red Army, death to the Nazis, mass meeting under the auspices of the Jewish American Lodge of the IWO. The IWO was a communist fraternal lodge, and I played a major role in what I'm talking about. A local rabbi speaking, a professor, and a representative of the Oakland Jewish Federation. And then finally, one more picture, same idea. You see a Bar Kokhba tank chasing down Hitler, and it's calling on Jews to raise money for 1,000 tanks and 500 airplanes. And here in this box is a list of names that are recommended for these tanks and bombers. Okay. All right. I think I did that right. Did I do that right? Okay.
It's perfect.
That's okay.
Yeah, you got it. Good.
Thank you for asking me. Okay, so I should just tell you that a lot of money was raised, upward of $100,000 was raised for these tanks and bombers, but nothing eventually came to pass, simply because American Jews really weren't authorized to purchase heavy weaponry for the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union called it off. It was kind of a strange affair. It was the idea of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee to raise money for these tanks and bombers, and then a number of months later, it called it off. But I mentioned it for 2 reasons. One, because a lot of money was raised for it. 2, it gives you, again, an image of the themes that were whirling around the American Jewish community during these years of heroic resistance and solidarity and Jewish national struggle and anti-fascism, all mixed together. I'm going to head towards a conclusion. The high point of this 4-year period of Jewish people's unity was a tour in 1943 of representatives of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Its leader, the actor and theater director Shlomo Michels, or Solomon Michels, and the Yiddish poet Itzik Pfeffer. They went on a 3-month tour around the United States, and it was really quite remarkable. They were greeted as dignitaries of the Soviet Union, not just by the Jewish community, but by mayors, city councils, civic organizations, senators, congressmen. They went around the country, raised large amounts of money, and were given really warm greetings that culminated in a massive rally at the Polo Grounds in New York, in which upward of 50,000 people attended and raised, again, a great deal of money. There were, that night, there were songs in Hebrew, Yiddish, and English. Hatikva was sung, that's the Jewish or Zionist national anthem. The Internationale was sung. The American national anthem was sung. Paul Robeson performed. There were speeches by people from representatives of the major Jewish organizations, such as Hadassah, the Zionist Organization of America, the B'nai B'rith, really almost all the mass organizations. I'm just going to read you one quote, and this is from the president of the B'nai B'rith, one of the largest Jewish organizations in the country. His name is Henry Mosse. And in his speech, he praised the Soviet Union for eliminating what he called racial hatred and went so far as to quote Stalin approvingly. I'm going to read the quote in full. We should emulate the Russians, we, meaning the United States, we should emulate the Russians in the standards which they set up of equal treatment of races of people, symbolized by the historic message of Stalin upon the occasion of the 24th anniversary of the Red Army. The Red Army is free from the feeling of racial hatred. It is free of such a degrading feeling because it has been brought up in the spirit of racial equality and respect for the rights of other people. Also, one should not forget that in our country, any manifestation of racial hatred is punished by law. He's talking about the Soviet Union. And that was a quote that was Mosse quoting Stalin. Mosse goes on to say, yes, and we are grateful to the Red Army who shared their food and supplies with refugee Jews, as well as others who came their way. These are bonds which transcend differences. Right. That was said by Mosse at the mass rally at the fairground, at the Polo Grounds in the summer of 1943. What's remarkable here, again, is the extent to which not only is he praising the war effort, but holding up the Soviet Union as a model which the United States should follow, specifically when it came to race relations. All right. So as the war goes on, this kind of rhetoric, this pro-Soviet, often connected with Jewish nationalism, was just simply escalated from year to year and grew more emotional, more intense, until, and now I'm going towards a conclusion, until it finally came to an end with the end of the war. With the end of the war, things changed actually very, very quickly. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union deteriorated quickly. And the Communist Party, by 1946, dropped, basically renounced the idea of Jewish people's unity in the United States. Very quickly, by 1946, the Communist Party said it was no longer interested in that. In fact, it began listing all the Jewish groups it refused to cooperate with. In fact, it left almost nobody to cooperate with. It went back to a previous policy of distancing itself from what it called bourgeois nationalists, religious Jews, the Jewish bourgeoisie, and so forth. So basically, another 180-degree turn took place after the war drew to a close. Let's say, postscript to this is the Soviet Union's, the American Communist Party's support for the creation of the State of Israel in 1947-48, following the Soviet Union's lead in pushing for the creation of the state during that same time period. This itself is its own interesting chapter in which the Communist Party threw itself wholeheartedly behind protests and fundraising efforts on behalf of the Jewish community of Palestine and protests against the United States government for not pursuing as vigorously or consistently as the Communist Party demanded its support for the Soviet Union. One important goal for the Communist Party was its insistence that the United States lift its arms embargo on the Middle East and start shipping weapons to Palestine. As it turned out, it was communist Czechoslovakia that provided the major funds, major arms shipments to Israel. The United States did not in the end lift its arms embargo. But beyond this final concluding episode of the Communist Party's support for the support for the State of Israel, this earlier period of the war of Jewish communal unity during the war ended, and as I said before, it ended abruptly. So what do we make of it? Was it a sham? Was it a kind of manipulation by the Soviet government of American Jews? And I think there are two answers to this. On the one hand, the answer I think is absolutely that it was. The creation of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was functioned as an arm of the Soviet state. It was not just permitted to operate, but it was overseen by the Soviet government. Its policies and strategies were approved by the Soviet government for the purpose of aiding the Soviet government's struggle against Nazi Germany. There was an element of cynicism in it. In other words, Jewish national themes were used to manipulate American Jews, to get them fired up, to act as enthusiastically as possible to support the war effort. All that is true. And when the Soviet Union's foreign policies changed, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee eventually came to an end. Its leaders murdered or imprisoned. And again, in the United States, the idea of Jewish communal unity was brought to a close. So I don't want to minimize that aspect to this episode. However, there's another way to look at it that's also true. And that is that there was, after the movement for Jewish unity came to an end, American communists retained one important aspect of it, and that is a support for Jewish culture, Jewish identity, and the like. It is, in fact, not just supportive of it, it became a central policy of the communists out after the war to promote Jewish culture, Jewish organizations, various sorts of Jewish activities. That included support for Israel, but it also included such things as creating Jewish schools for adults, publishing works on Jewish history and culture, some of which reached really large audiences in the United States. To give you just one quick example, a book called A Treasury of Jewish Folklore, written by a communist writer named Nathan Ausubel, 1947, went through something like a dozen editions within a matter of years. All right, these and other kinds of activities on behalf of Jewish culture, the creation of folk choirs, of records and concerts and folk festivals celebrating Jewish culture in Yiddish, Hebrew, and English, became part and parcel of communist life in the 1940s and into the 1950s. And beyond that, contributed to a revival of interest in Eastern European Jewish life, Jewish history, and Jewish education. So that the Jewish communal unity, although it was born out of an instrumental need to mobilize American Jews on behalf of the war effort, took on a life of its own after the war, at least in the United States, among a broad portion of the American left. And in that regard, it came to have a long imprint in the American Jewish community. I'm going to leave it at that, and hopefully we still have time for questions and comments.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I really think it challenges a lot of assumptions that I think many people, many of us have about the relationship with the Soviet Union and the American Jewish community. There are a number of, I think, very interesting and pertinent questions and comments that sort of have to do with the period before and after the war. So thinking about perhaps 1941 and then the rest of the war as a particular moment, perhaps, and then how to maybe situate this, with certain things which were going on before and after the war. So we have actually two questions and comments from Rick McCormick. The first one is, what about the situation between August 1939 and June 1941, when the Communist Party supported peace with Nazi Germany? This was a difficult time for many communists, and I would guess especially so for Jewish communists and other Jews. And then the second question, looking at after the war, and it's also similar to a question posed by Steve Miller as well. This campaign, speaking about the campaign in support, Jewish unity in support of the Soviet Union, must have gotten some American Jews in trouble during the Red Scare. It must have been one more charge against John Garfield, for instance. Can you talk about this? The other question from Stephen Martin was, were there repercussions for some of the supporters of the Soviet war effort during the McCarthy era? So a similar question. So
I'll take the first question, which refers to the Nazi, Soviet Nazi non-aggression pact between 39 and 41. As the writer noted, this was incredibly controversial in the United States, certainly in the Jewish community, with those who were the anti-communists pointed to it and said, basically, what do you expect? This is just one more example of Stalin's total lack of principles. And what more evidence do you need? Then you had a fair number of communists, especially intellectuals, who left the party. Same with liberal fellow travelers. A surprisingly high number, however, of Jewish communists stayed in the party. There was actually not a substantial loss of Communist Party members because of this. I think the big damage had to do with, I think the biggest damage was among sympathizers of the party, more than actually the number of party members themselves who rationalized it one way or another. All right. The guy I named before, the chairman of the Writers' Committee, Chaim Shidlovsky, was one of those people who justified it. So once the once Germany invaded Russia and Russia formed the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, everything changed. It changed overnight. And I think, I mean, again, for the anti-communists on the left, socialists, social democrats, Bundists, anarchists, Trotskyists, they didn't change their minds at all. They opposed the whole thing as a sham from the outset. I didn't discuss that. But there was a segment of the Jewish community in the left that wanted nothing to do with what I discussed this afternoon. That's important to note. But those who did, and there were many liberals, as I said, many Zionists and others, their view was, look, the situation is now different. The future of the Jews rises and falls on the Red Army. And so the minimum view is we have to support this struggle. And if we do it with the communists, we have to do it with the communists, and that's what we'll do. But what again I found so fascinating here is that I believe expectations rose much higher than that. Encouraged by the Jewish anti-fascist community, again, which kept using Jewish national rhetoric. Jews, our brother Jews across the Atlantic, we Jews, we members of the Jewish people. This was a constant feature of the rhetoric. I think that served to really heighten nationalist expectations, in the case of some religious Jews, messianic expectations. Again, I don't think that was a flourish by Rabbi Lookstein. I think that was genuine. That emotion that came out of the war, I think it just overcame any previous conflicts that existed over communism prior to 1941. I think both the stakes were too high and the desires were too great. In other words, if the Soviet Union could somehow become the power that would allow Jews to achieve long-standing goals, such as the creation of Yiddish culture on a global scale, that's Chaim Shidlovsky, or the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine, like Nahum Goldman said, or Stephen Weiss, who I didn't quote, or Monsky, right? Then that's great. Maybe the Soviet Union is now changing forever. Maybe it will now become, in a post-war world, the guardians of Jewish nationality. Or these were genuine hopes that helped to explain why past divisions quickly fell by the wayside during the war. Now, the other question had to do with the post-war period, which is really fascinating by itself. I think a couple of things here, I think, that are worth noting. And in doing that, I'm going to answer the question that was posed about how dangerous this was for Jews. Well, let me just start with that. Maybe that's the best way to go. Let me just start with that question. I view, after doing this research, I started to view the post-war period, the McCarthy period in particular, in a somewhat different light. It really, for me, drove home how insecure and how scared Jews must have been going into the Cold War period, because the Cold War is already evident by 1947. You have Jewish leaders almost across the board saying the Soviet Union is not only our friend, it's a model worth emulating. My God, what were all those Jews, what must have been running through their heads in 46 and 47, knowing that they were on record over and over again, praising Stalin and the heroism of the Soviet people and all these other things, the greatness of the Soviet system. I mean, they must have been really terrified. I mean, I know I'm not the first person to say this, but it becomes especially dramatic and clear to me, given when you look at the concrete level and just think for a moment that only 12 months passed, or more or less, maybe slightly more, between the onset of McCarthy, of the anti-communist crusade, and what Jews were on record as saying publicly and often. So I think, yes, I think the idea that they were scared became all the more, well, it's all the more clear to me, and I think they must have felt it really acutely. The other thing I think to note about this is I think Jews also felt, in addition to being afraid, I think they also felt extremely angry towards communists in the Soviet Union after the war, for a couple of reasons that I mentioned, but I want to just underscore now. One, the communists in America went in a sectarian, hostile direction very, very quickly. So that's one. They started denouncing their allies almost overnight, the allies in the Jewish community. The other thing is that the Soviet Union, by the 1950s, was clearly entering a period in which anti-Semitism was an aspect of state policy. Again, Michels disappears, Yiddish writers are being murdered, Zionism is being repressed, anti-Semitism is, there's the doctor's plot, Yiddish cultural institutions are being dismantled. So I think those two emotions exist side by side in the late 40s and the 50s: fear of anti-communism, and anger at the Soviet Union and the American Communist Party for what they viewed as betrayal and indeed manipulation. I don't think we can understand how the Cold War played out in the Jewish community without understanding those two facts. So that's how. Now I should say one more thing. Most of this whole episode I discussed mostly went into a black hole by the end of the 40s, because neither side, the communists or the Jewish communal organizations, had any incentive to recall it. The communists had disavowed it, and the American Jewish communal leaders certainly didn't want to make themselves vulnerable to an alliance they probably themselves felt ambivalent about by the end of the 40s. So people just ceased to talk about what was so much such a big part of Jewish life and American life during the first half of the 40s.
Excellent. Well, I think we have time if you'll stay with us for a few more minutes.
I've got nothing but time.
Okay. So there are a couple more questions, and so we can conclude after these. There are a couple questions about inter-community organization relationships during the war. One from Doug Rossinow: Did this wartime mobilization have any relations, negative or positive, with the American Jewish Conference, or maybe, I guess, the American Jewish Conference or the American Zionist Emergency Council, which were both established in 1943? And then from Gary Cohen, regarding the support of American communists for Jewish culture and Jewish community life after World War II, do you see any significant friction or tension between the communists and Jewish religious institutions, given the conventional communist atheist stance and conventional communist hostility to organized religion? So,
so I'll start with the question about the American Jewish Conference, which was created, was it 42, 43, maybe it's 43, by actually by Henry Monsky and some associates. The idea was to create an overarching Jewish communal organization that would represent Jewish interests to the United States government or on the international plane. This is not the first time Jews had attempted this. This was attempted during World War I for similar purposes in a similar crisis of a similar atmosphere of crisis. So the conference was to be a kind of, Congress, they called it a conference, but you get the point, that all these different organizations would come together to speak, to present an agenda at the national and international level. Communists really wanted to be part of it, very, very strongly. And eventually, it took a while because there was some opposition to the communists joining. But in 1944, communist organizations were admitted to the American Jewish Conference. And so for communists rather, this was the big payoff. They had been admitted to the premier, aimed to be the premier Jewish national organization in the country. They were part of the mainstream now, like never before or never since. They were at the table. They were at the table with the American Jewish Congress, B'nai B'rith, Hadassah, Zionist Organization of America. We can go down the list. They won a seat at the table. Now they did this. In preparing for this, they changed their position on Zionism during the war. Prior to 1941, communists always viewed Zionism as a form of imperialism, and communists rejected it for that reason, sometimes really, really militantly. But by as soon as the Moscow rally took place, you could look at the communist press and you start to see positive depictions of life in the Yishuv, in the Jewish community of Palestine. The achievements of Hadassah in Jerusalem, or let's look at Hebrew music or whatever, these kinds of very positive articles. Later, it'd be this kind of reassessment of Zionism in a positive way gets more and more explicit. So, for example, in January 1943, the communist Yiddish daily newspaper is called Die Morgenfreiheit. The Freiheit printed a statement saying that Zionism is progressive, it's a progressive force, and anti-Zionism is a force of fascism and disunity. Now, the paper stopped short of saying we are Zionists, but they condemned anti-Zionism, as I said, and they endorsed the idea of Jewish national rights in Palestine. What that meant in concrete political goals was left unclear, but it was clear that communists now supported Jewish national rights and the idea of a vaguely defined Jewish national homeland in Palestine. And that became simply more and more pronounced during the war. So the communists, it was important, it helped facilitate communist acceptance into the American Jewish Conference. And in doing it, it outmaneuvered, and you could say in certain ways, more prominent and established organizations like the American Jewish Committee, which was quite intently non-Zionist. And communists used to have a field day going after the American Jewish Committee, calling them bourgeois assimilationists. Bourgeois because the leaders come out of the Jewish bourgeoisie, and assimilationists because they refused to endorse nationalism for Jews in Palestine or anywhere else. So, communists really moved into the consensus that was emerging in the 40s around Jewish statehood.
Right.
There was a question about education and religion. One thing that I think was really significant about the communist promotion of Jewish culture and education is that it was done among English-speaking Jews. Prior to the war, there was a lot of communist culture, but it was in Yiddish, by Yiddish-speaking communists in Yiddish-speaking organizations. But during the war and after the war, a new phenomenon arose, and that is English-speaking American Jewish communists who had previously been alienated from Jewish life, in fact, in many cases, we're talking about people who wanted nothing to do with Jews whatsoever in an organized fashion. And what you see during and after the war are really the publication of heartfelt essays saying, for years, I was ashamed to be a Jew. Now I'm no longer ashamed to be a Jew. It's good to be a Jew. A Jew makes you a better anti-fascist. And we should be proud of that. And that's what comes out of one long-term result of this Jewish community, Jewish unity movement was, again, American Jewish communists coming together to promote Jewish culture. And that was entirely sincere. No one was making them do that. It was entirely voluntary. And it was two things drove it. It was the war and the genuine sympathy for Jews because of the Holocaust. And then the stamp of approval that the Soviet Union gave to it. So you have Soviet approval given to a genuinely felt emotion that outlived the war itself. Among, again, a section of the Jewish population that prior to the war had nothing to do with Jewish culture. And now they were learning Yiddish and teaching Jewish history and, all that stuff. What did it mean for religion? Was there friction? I mean, all this culture was secular. It was communists were very vocal about that. They often didn't denounce religion, though. In other words, it was secular, but in this period, I don't recall seeing denunciations of religion. And I don't recall much friction. Let me put it this way. There was friction between communists in the late 40s and 50s with the rest of the Jewish community, but it didn't have to do with their atheism as far as I could tell. It had to do with questions of politics. That's my sense of it. I could be wrong. Surely religious Jews resented the atheism of communists, but I don't recall it being a flashpoint of conflict. By the way, there was one interesting rabbi who was Orthodox and a communist, but that's a story from another time.
Well, speaking of a story for another time, I think we really look forward to reading your current work in the future. And I want to thank everyone for coming and participating today in this great conversation and lecture, and especially to thank Tony for giving such an interesting and enlightening talk. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Daniel. Appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for attending.